Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jody Rudoran. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Forward. We're going to give people a minute to roll in here. You're at our Zoom event called Divided We Fall. We're going to be talking about how different groups have been experiencing the crises of 2020 and how those divisions threaten to undermine our democracy and what we can do about it, what we can do to help people understand each other's experiences across ethnic or racial or socioeconomic or political divides. Again, if you're just coming in, I'm Jody Rudoran. I'm editor-in-chief of The Forward, and we're thrilled today to have some really exciting activists who work at different nonprofits joining us for this conversation. We have Gina Kraus-Vilmer, who is the CEO of Upwardly Global. Upwardly Global is a nonprofit that helps immigrants get back into their original professions or careers. We're talking about those engineers who are driving rideshare. And Gina was telling me before the event started that one of the things they've been doing in the last few months is working with 165,000 doctors around the country who are trained in other countries and are either unemployed or not in the healthcare sector. And even now in the middle of this public health crisis, we have that huge number. So that's one of the things we'll talk about with Gina. And then we have Ari Gordon, who's director of U.S. Muslim-Jewish relations at the American Jewish Committee. He has been working for years to help Jews and Muslims take joint action on issues of common concern, to foster engagement across those divides. And this year recently has been very involved with other nonprofits in advocating for stronger hate crimes laws against white supremacy. And we've just been joined by Jennifer Apps-Addison, who's co-executive director of the Center for Popular Democracy. This is one of the leading progressive organizations nationally. There are local affiliates across the country. Jennifer, welcome. Trying to read your sign behind you.
Hi, thank you. Yes.
Yes,
thank you.
right.
Sorry.
That's what
I'm sorry. I'm like trying to run into a room because I have kids in school in one room, my husband on the phone on another room. So
it is
I apologize.
okay. We are all in the same boat. I was saying that I'm like in my cold basement with my muff here, and I may be putting on more clothes. Ari is fictionally in some beautiful, pristine college library, but Gina's in Brooklyn and keeping it real there. Anyway, so thank you again for joining us. For those in the audience, just a couple of logistical, practical notes. We are recording this conversation. We're also broadcasting it live on Facebook. If you want to share the Jewish Daily Forward's page with your followers, they can meet us there. And we will be emailing you and anyone who registered for the event a recording of it, along with any links that we post in the chat and some highlights. So don't stress if you miss anything, you'll get the video. And you can use the chat. If you have a comment to make to the entire group, you should make sure you press all panelists and attendees in that instance. If you have a question that you want me to pose to the panelists or a comment just for me and the panelists, better not to use the chat, better use the Q&A button or to chat directly to me. The chat gets a little overwhelming, which is why I ask you to use the Q&A button. Both of these buttons are probably found on the bottom if you're on a computer and on the left if you're on a tablet or phone. And that's, I think, all the tachlis we have today. So I am gonna jump right in by really just asking each of you to sort of catch us up a little bit. It's funny, now we're like careening towards the election, but I'd love to just take a little bit of a look back. Tell us a little bit about how the pandemic has changed your focus, your organization's focus. What is something that has shifted your work that you can just bring us a little bit up to date as to what your organizations are doing right now in this pandemic. I'm going to start with you, Gina.
Great, and thanks. I am so thrilled to be here. So I think that there's a couple of things. So Upwardly Global, we actually work with immigrants who are in the United States and help them get back into their professions. So during COVID, you heard Jody speak about there are 165,000 internationally trained doctors in the United States today. They're unemployed and underemployed, and there is a real crisis on our hands. And so we are working hard, both really at the policy level, but also at the implementation level to get these folks into healthcare roles. so that they can be supporting on the front lines. I think the second thing that we have been doing more of is working more in coalition with other organizations and other partners, very much apropos to the theme of the conversation today, which is it is going to take our collective strength in order to rebuild and recover as a country, and that we really want to come together around sort of our strengths as communities. And so we have been doing a lot more work and spending a lot more time trying to build relationships, deep relationships with other organizations whom we have actually not really been in touch with in the past. And then I think the third is trying to move some bipartisan pieces of legislation where there is any space to do that. And it is really, really hard, but we're not giving up. Never give up, never surrender, as I tell my kids. And so we do have a bipartisan bill that we have been able to help draft with Representative Kat Coe of New York, who's a Republican, to help sort of look at the invisibility of our community, which is people who come with skills, who are new Americans, but end up going into low wage work and either sit in this realm of you're an immigrant and therefore you are low wage labor, or you're skilled and how could you possibly be poor? And so we are sort of trying to focus on those three things where we can.
Thanks, Gina. I'm going to get back to you about some of that coalition building because I think it's all too rare these days. Jennifer, tell us a little bit about what you and your organization have been up to that's new in COVID life.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, this is such a, I feel like 20 years from now, my grandchildren will be asking me to describe this period in the world, and I will be, at a loss of what to say. Will I talk about the global pandemic in which Americans have 20 times the rate of infection and, death? Will I talk about the rise of white supremacy and racist authoritarianism that, threatens the progress that my grandparents and ancestors fought and died for in this country? Will I talk about the racial reckoning and potential for reconciliation, because we have not gotten to reconciliation yet, through the uprisings in the streets all summer, and I think will likely to continue, past election day. It's hard to really imagine, but for our members, the thing that has kept, our members are majority Black and Brown. We have affiliates in 35 states, Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. And these are, low income, no income, working class folks who are feeling the brunt of this pandemic, right? Like middle class folks like me got to shelter in place, but for working class and poor folks and no income folks, right? They were the labor, they are the labor that has kept our country and economy going and kept many of us alive and better protected. And so, what they've really shared to us in this moment is that the things that they were fighting for before this pandemic, healthcare for every single person who lives in the country's boundaries, right? A house for everyone, ensuring that the right to a quality public school is truly a right, regardless of what geography or zip code you were born into in this country, that these things, these fundamental restructuring of the American ideal and promise for everyone, were the things that were needed before this pandemic. And lucky for us, they're actually the same things that are needed in this pandemic to not only get us through it, but to rebuild and restructure this country so we can all thrive after it. Which feels like so long away in this moment, but we have to put that into our imagination, because we certainly can't emerge from this moment thinking that we can go back to a status quo, as 62 million people have lost their jobs, and many of them, along with their jobs, their healthcare, because the way healthcare is structured in this country. So that's the fight we're having, and our goal is always, as always, is to get as many people having the conversations, not just about what's right in front of us, right, the scaffolding we built because a pandemic hit us, but to have the conversation about what is the future that we want. How do we build the country of our dreams, and how do we use this moment to really have a reconciliation in this country and to restructure it so that everybody has the opportunity to thrive?
Yeah, that's really inspiring. I mean, I feel like that's certainly the goal. The danger, of course, is that when there's more urgent needs that, are coming up, and that people can ignore some of the things that you were talking about before. And we'll get more into that later on. Ari, tell us a little bit about how your work has shifted in these months.
Sure. Thanks, Jody, and thanks to the Forward for hosting this important discussion. It's an honor to be here with co-panelists doing such amazing work. It's interesting, Jody, that American Jewish Committee, which is 114 years old, has seen a lot of history. We've done a lot of work for Jews and civil rights, democratic values, human rights, our work on Israel and trying to find a sustainable peace with justice and security for Israelis and Palestinians. But in the US context, I mean, we've seen a lot, and somehow the last months have thrown us some things that are, the word unprecedented gets thrown around a lot, but certainly when we talk about COVID, when we talk about the reckoning and awareness long overdue with racial inequalities and the need for justice in this country that has not been served, and then another contentious election cycle that just feeds the polarization that's already there and the political tribalism. And so in some ways, these are new, and in some ways they're not new. Let me take them in reverse order with a few. I mean, with the election and how split we are, we see our identities as religious, ethnic minorities, immigrants as well. We get pulled, and sometimes we become political footballs. Parties, for us as Jews, parties telling us your only home is here, and those folks on the other side of the aisle, they're your enemies. And some of what we do is we push back with a bipartisan or nonpartisan approach. You want to talk to everyone so that they cannot take you for granted. As Jews in our long history, I think we know that we're best served when everyone sees us as their constituent. And we have the power to do that when we work in coalition with people across the aisle. And we see this in our Muslim-Jewish relations work, the Muslim-Jewish Advisory Council that I help oversee. When we sit with lawmakers, we often take turns with the joke saying, you think it's hard to bring Muslims and Jews together. We're trying to get you to work with your partners on the other side of the aisle to take domestic terrorism, white supremacy, and hate crimes more seriously. In terms of racial and economic justice that we're seeing and that has really thankfully come to the fore, unfortunately, because of the tragic murder of George Floyd and the other deaths at the hands of police and others. For us as Jews, this speaks to who we are, but we also need to use it as an opportunity to join hands, to heal divides. We know that there are divides between Black Americans and Jewish Americans. We have so much in common. We have such a strong history. We have a lot to work together on, and we got to sit at the table and work on those things and understand one another where we don't. AJC hosted a Black Jewish Unity Week over the summer in partnership with the Urban League. Not that these are the only two organizations doing this work, but really trying to wave a flag and say, it's time that we join hands again, because the needs that we have facing both of our communities are too strong to ignore.
Ari, I'm glad you got us there. So let me probe a little deeper. We're obviously a Jewish news organization, and a lot of our audience today, I'm sure, is Jewish, and our conversation is broader than that. But this question of Black-Jewish relations, and I should emphasize that there are also Jews of color, Black Jews within our community too, but the relationships between white Jews and African Americans over time is a kind of up and down fraught history between the civil rights movement, what happened in Crown Heights, and then the whole trajectory in the last few years with Black Lives Matter and Zionism in particular, which had a kind of particularly ugly moment in the first incarnation, and then mostly I think has been better this year. But I wonder what you're seeing, Jennifer, and then we can go back to Ari a little bit about what's the state of Black-Jewish relations, or of the relationship between the Black Lives Matter movement in particular and the Zionist question or the Jewish question. I mean, how do you see it, Jennifer? If you even engage with that question from your perspective, I don't know.
I think, there is no one state of the Black-Jewish relationship, right? As you sort of acknowledged in just your opening remarks here, there are many, different types of Jews in this country, right? There are many different Black folks in this country. None of us are a monolith, and each of us carry the experience of our ancestors, our cultural legacy, our traditions, our communities, the neighborhoods we grew up in, the people we grew up around, right? And that shapes, you know, our worldview. And so first and foremost, I think we're in a moment in which the, you know, white nationalism that has come from the White House, from Stephen Miller to Steve Bannon to President Trump, has, you know, opened up a dialogue that we haven't had access to really maybe since the civil rights movement, about the ways in which white supremacy targets and harms both Black folks and Jewish folks alike. And we saw that with the tragic murders of Jewish folks, and in particular the synagogue shootings, right? And targeting. So I think, you know, this gives us an opportunity again to, as you said, reevaluate, to reshare, to amplify our shared histories, both of struggle, but also of resistance together, right? And to really name those things. At the same time, I think that there is a real reckoning that I have been sort of humbled to watch from the sidelines as the movement for Black Lives and you know, many Jewish organizations, you know, AJC and others included, right, have had really difficult, challenging conversations on everything from reparations to relationships with Israel and Palestine, right? And these are ongoing. They're ongoing, incredibly complicated, you know, discussions to have, and yet they're critically important, right? As we come to find a value in what does freedom mean for everybody, as we come to sort of have a shared understanding of what does it look like to allow for difference, to in fact celebrate difference, but then to not allow difference to become a mask for oppression, right? These are the real questions we're having, you know, not just in the Black and Jewish communities, but really in America and globally in this moment, as we see sort of ethnoism and ethno-nationalism, right, taking hold, not just here in America, but in Brazil and Hungary and the United Kingdom and many other places across the world.
Let me amplify that a little bit, Gina, and ask you guys all. I mean, I feel like there's so many forces that are pushing people apart right now. I mean, I feel like definitely in our country, I mean, I covered the 2004 presidential campaign. That was a long time ago. In our politics, it seemed like an incredibly divided country. I think we're probably still just as divided, only with maybe different numbers, but I mean, just like harder walls between us politically. As you say, that's a trend happening in many ways around the world. Then we have the various ways in which the social media platforms and other technologies kind of create these filter bubbles that help separate people's experiences. There are more and more partisan news sources that people are exposed to. And then we have this pandemic, which, as I said a little bit in the beginning, is just like, has, I think, been really in some ways isolating by community, which sort of plays into the way that our homogenous organizations of our housing or schools or whatever, it's made those walls bigger. So I wonder if you can talk, that's not really a question, so I'll just try to frame a couple, which is to think, I'd love to hear what you all think about whether right now we're more divided than ever, or if you see some bridges that are being built that you're encouraged by. And maybe if you want to talk a little bit about at least those three forces and how you think, which of those are the ones that are most to blame for the divisions that we're seeing, or which of them might be able to be turned around and made into bridges. Gina, why don't we start with you and then Ari?
I mean, I would add something that you didn't mention, which is poverty, right? I think this has always been a country of have and have-nots. I think we see real income inequality in this country today. I think the middle class is being hollowed out. I think that have and have-not narrative is very much aligned with color and background. And I think that is part of a big part of the conversation that we're not having, which is, what does that look like? How do we provide access and opportunity? How do we provide economic mobility? And how do we allow people to define culture in the workplace so that it works for everyone? And it breaks away from this historic narrative of exploitation and work. And it's exploitation and work and immigration, right? Whether people were forcefully coming to this country or whether they came by choice, it's all been a very exploitative experience around how does immigration fill an economic gap for this country? How do we exploit that labor And then how do some benefit from that while others do not? And how does that system revolve around it? So, I mean, I think the biggest driver for us really is to talk about what does that polarization look like in income inequality? How does that align to color and socioeconomic background and faith and all of those things? And how do we shift that dynamic of really thinking about what Jennifer was talking about, which is like, how do you share privilege? How do you redefine the rules of the game and the system when it was created for something very, very different than I think where we are trying to get to now today as a country and where we need to get to? I mean, just from an immigrant perspective, in 2050, 83% of growth in the working age population will come from immigrants and the children of immigrants. These are people that need to be integrated into the economy, and they are capable of doing so much more than low wage labor work, right? That's also not the demographic of people that are coming into this country today. 50%, close to 50% have a college degree or higher, right? And so how do we shift a lot of these dynamics and these narratives so that we can create real more inclusive economic growth?
I like what you said, Gina, in naming this challenge that we have in the political moment, that sometimes we're transactional when we talk about other identity communities. Like what is their economic place? What is their political utility? To what extent do they get me votes, or do they fill a hole? But something, Jennifer, that you said that seems almost like an antidote is just recognizing that individuals and groups have so much diversity. We have our own stories. Individuals do bring that to the table. And in some ways, that's what's lost in the media moment that we're living in. And I think social media has a lot to do with this, but it probably goes back to even the rise of cable news, where we're surrounding ourselves with the echo chambers of the ideas that we want to hear. And so everyone who's other, everyone who's outside my political tribe, whether it or my group or my community, the people I'm in touch with, they become an object that I can place in a marketplace, whether that's economic, political, or otherwise. In some ways, the best thing we can do for ourselves and for our country is to rescue the humanity of those people who aren't in our communities and who aren't at the table with us.
Jennifer?
But I want to, I was thinking about this question of polarization for a second. And I think that I have two thoughts on it, because this has always been a heavily polarized country, right? People were polarized as to whether or not we should have slaves, whether or not women should have rights to vote, whether or not, Black people should be able to sit in the same, train car as whites, et cetera, right? This has always been a very polarized country. But I think that there's a couple of things happening. First and foremost, I think that the inherent, like, we are seeing the remnants of a system created to protect inequality and enslavement and the interests of slaveholders, right? Come to bear on a country that is soon to be or a majority people of color country, right? And we're seeing the flaw and the crack in that system come to bear. And so the inherent unfairness of anywhere from 3 million to 5 million more votes, right, going to one candidate and yet another candidate being selected leads to a situation in which people don't begin to have an erosion of trust in the system and belief that the system truly represents them. And which leads to the second problem, which is the largest group of voters in this country is not Democratic voters or Republican voters, it's non-voters, right? And so there's a whole host of people who have opted out of the real purpose of democracy, which is not just clicking the lever and voting, but it's actually feeling a sense of ownership and buy-in to the institutions that govern our lives in a country, right? We all have to have a shared level of buy-in to the fact that our court system, our school system, our healthcare system, our economy are going to govern our lives, and we're going to play by a set of rules because we trust in those systems. And so, I feel like framing it as polarization makes us think of it as personal attitudes or something like that, when in actuality, right, what we're seeing is a reckoning in a system that wasn't created or structured for the level of individual personalized democracy we could have in this moment, right? It wasn't created for everyone to have a say, even though that's our opinion of what democracy should be.
As I'm listening to you, Jennifer, I'm thinking about, I was going to ask you about kind of how you think how critically the divisions threaten democracy, right? Like how bad is it for the health of democracy? And I was thinking a little bit about how, I was going to say most of us felt pretty good about our democracy until pretty recently when like things were flooded with disinformation. But I think you're making a really good point, which is, people who were pretty enfranchised felt pretty good about our democracy and our institutions, and that there were a lot of people for whom those institutions weren't working 10, 20, and 50 and 100 years ago too. And now that it really starts to feel like the wheels are falling off, like, when the president says he's not sure he's going to leave office and nobody trusts that votes are being counted, like the people in power and the upper and middle classes are really like, oh no, what's happening with our democracy? But you're saying in some ways this is a little bit of a reality check about how broken it's been in the first place. Interesting. So, okay. Tell me about, I was going to, let's keep going on this democracy theme, not leave it. But meanwhile, I'll also ask you a little bit about whether you are feeling like the groups you're working with and are living in are kind of more and more isolated and separate, or you are seeing connections and empathy happening across groups, or any examples of either one? Are things worse or better in terms of divisions in your day-to-day work? I would ask you, particularly maybe Gina and Jennifer, who are doing such, all three of you are working closely with different communities. Who wants to start?
I will take that hand raise as a pass, Jennifer. I would say our communities are feeling more isolated than ever before. I think the pandemic has exacerbated the mechanism to feel isolated. I think they have felt isolated under this administration in particular for a while. And there's a real culture of fear that has been harnessed and encouraged in the immigrant community by over 80 policies and administrative changes under this administration. So I would say this feeling of isolation has been exacerbated really more through the policy and administrative changes. I think the pandemic has physically created some isolation, but I think that isolation was there already because the message is you're not welcome here and you are not wanted, and you should leave, especially for our communities. And so I would say that's probably the reality. But on the same hand, I would say like there is so much to hope for. Under the pandemic, I mean, you see like immigrants are really at the front lines of healthcare, of logistics engineers, and all kinds of crucial businesses we depend on. I think what the pandemic has demonstrated is how much we depend on each other. And I think in some cases, a real appreciation for people showing up and raising their hands. 29% of doctors caring for COVID patients are immigrants. 25% of the employees in the biomedical industry that's currently hustling for a vaccine are immigrants, right? Like there's a diverse community of people right now who are really pulling together and raising their hands to contribute. And I think that's actually deeply inspirational. Just one quick anecdote. We have a number of internationally trained doctors. When we surveyed them, like within 2 weeks within the pandemic in New York, 93% said that they would be willing to volunteer on the front lines, despite knowing the risks that presented to them and their family members of contracting the disease. And it was really because they felt this sense of, I need to get back to my community. I took an oath. And we've seen a lot of doctors. There was, I think of Keisha, who's a fully licensed physician in Poland, who has been living in Boston, and she quit her survival job and is now working in a medical center providing COVID-19 screening. Now that's not anywhere as an equivalent to her physician job, right? But it is sort of a nod to the fact that she really does feel like she wants to be able to give back and provide in this moment. So I think it's a mix. For our community in particular, I think the isolation was there. I think the pandemic definitely didn't help. I think mental health is a real thing in our communities as well. But I do think that it has demonstrated how dependent we are, and I think that's been a positive thing.
I'm just going to pause with Gina for a second because Beth Miller, one of our audience members, has asked this question that's kind of on the point she's talking about. He said she didn't know, and I think a lot of us didn't know about all those unemployed doctors or other healthcare workers. She says, wow. She's asking, she asks, does your agency need donations, or do you think donations are needed more elsewhere? So if you could put in the chat, Gina, or we can mail out afterwards some links to any place people might want to donate. But I also just want to ask you to break it down for us a little bit about what is, I mean, it's such an obvious question, right? But obviously, we all know we need more healthcare workers right now. There's 165,000 trained doctors. What are the obstacles to getting them into those jobs that we could, where they could be doing this good work? If they're, you just gave us all these great numbers. People are willing to sacrifice and risk. So what are the obstacles you're facing to make this happen?
So, I mean, the large part is it's a highly regulated industry. It's very expensive and time consuming to go back into the medical field when you came from the medical field from a different country. There have been several states in the United States under COVID who have created temporary licensing for these doctors. And many doctors have raised their hands. I think New Jersey is one state, and they had over thousands of applications from internationally trained doctors living in New Jersey who said, yes, I want to help, even though that was a temporary opportunity. So I think part of it is the bureaucratic red tape that we put in place. I think part of it is it's incredibly expensive. I think part of it is you have to redo residency, and it is not easy not having a network in the United States to be able to get into residency, not having US-based clinical experience. So how do you get that if you don't know a doctor? And so I think that's a challenge. And of course, yes, as a nonprofit, we always welcome donations, but also volunteers and people in the industry.
I'll encourage each of you to put your links into the chat for donations. Also, the Forward is a nonprofit. You're welcome to donate to us. And I will say that everybody who's on this call and registered for this event will be offered a discount subscription to the Forward in your email follow-up. But Ari and Jennifer, let's, sorry to go off into a little bit of a tangent there, but I thought it was really interesting. But let's circle back to this question of kind of how concerned you are about the divisions and what it means for our democratic institutions, our democratic functioning, and or what examples you're seeing in your work of new coalitions being built.
Yeah, I appreciate the question about concern. And when you ask Jews about concern, you're asking about worry, which is something we're very good at. AJC's survey on anti-Semitism, actually just released today, showed that we're not all worried about the same thing. So 8 in 10 or close to 9 in 10 Jews believe anti-Semitism is a bigger problem, is a major problem in the country, compared with half of what other Americans see it as a problem. 7 in 10 non-Jewish Americans think that if a Jew says something is anti-Semitic, it either doesn't affect their opinion of whether that's the case, or actually they're less likely to think it is. So like this division that's out there sometimes comes in the way that we look at our own issues and we see out there people aren't necessarily taking them in the same way. But for me, something I've seen at the Muslim Jewish Advisory Council and in AJC's Muslim Jewish work is that sometimes that's a cause for conversation. And like when you point out to people that someone who harbors anti-Semitic views is 32 times more likely to be Islamophobic, that very few people are one issue haters. The white supremacists that are out there and kind of have a lot of people on their radar screen, that African Americans are the largest target of hate crimes, Jews the largest target of religiously motivated hate crimes, Muslims the largest growing target. And when we sit down at the table, so of course there's stuff that we can work on together. We're working for the passage of the No Hate Act, which is a bill to improve hate crimes reporting with bipartisan support. I'll put a link in the chat so you can contact your congressman. But we also talk about those places where we don't see eye to eye. So if I'm sitting at the table with you and I say that something hurts me, but you don't see it that way, then we've got to do that. We've got to understand the tropes, the dog whistles, the things that feed into that hatred towards the other community. And some of it is because I want to know, as a moral, good, ethical person, what hurts you. And frankly, I also really think that if we're in honest partnership, you got to know what hurts me too.
Jennifer, what do you make of that? I mean, I don't have.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's so much there. And I would say, first of all, yes, before this pandemic, the rates of depression and anxiety across society were already at a all-time high. This pandemic has certainly exacerbated that, as well as a host of things like economic insecurity, isolation, etc. And that's real. I think that, the truth is that the majority of this country that, talks to who they talk to, it's people usually who live in close proximity to them or their family members. The internet has given us a wide breadth of people to engage with, but we do it in really, we do it in really different ways. And so, I think those things are real. I also think that for our members and for the work that we do at the Center for Popular Democracy, what they experience as their American experience, which oftentimes is isolation and oppression and exclusion. As Gina was saying, being told, we don't want you here, you don't deserve to be here, you don't deserve nice things. The list goes on and on and on, right? Like that is their predominant American experience, is one of exclusion and isolation. They find that like coming into collective action together, the idea that, whatever you're struggling with is actually not a personal flaw, despite what this country will try to tell you about meritocracy, right? It's not actually your fault, but in actuality, millions of people, tens of millions of people, sometimes hundreds of millions of people are facing those exact same struggles. It is a systemic flaw that we can actually correct together through our participation. They find an immense amount of power and reassurance. And, I never thought I really understood the stories my grandmother would tell me about her time, on housing strikes and organizing and whatnot. And I never understood how people who had so little were always the ones who were the most joyful, were the ones who were the most giving, the most generous, right? The most caring. And it is something like, there's something about the way those relationships form and the freedom that comes from understanding that you're not alone, that's really transformative. And I think we saw that this summer, the movement for Black Lives. And if you go back and read the policy platform for Black Lives, it is a transformative vision for this nation and for the world, right? For imperialism, for colonialism, for capitalism, for so many of the things that impact how we experience the world. But it became, I think, the largest social movement in the history of this country, through the leadership of Black folks, yes, but because a whole lot of non-Black people decided that they could not sit on the sidelines any further, or allowed the sort of both sides-ism of all lives matter versus Black lives matter, that they actually had to make a choice. And tens of millions of people made the choice to get in the street, many of whom did it for the first time. Some of them who did it in small Wisconsin towns by themselves as grown men yelled at them for holding a Black Lives Matter sign, right? But they did it. And that to me is really transformative. It's what gives me hope that even in this moment, as we are staring down a very dangerous racist authoritarian, and, to be quite honest with you, a Democratic ticket who has promised us nothing will fundamentally change, this is what gives me hope that actually everything is about to fundamentally change.
Yeah, Jennifer, I don't know if you remember, but a couple of months ago, the New York Times, maybe earlier, maybe like in July, the New York Times ran this amazing package that showed all of the places that there were protests, and it showed all these tiny towns, and there were these amazing photographs in all these places. And it really, especially for if you weren't on the streets, or if you'd been, especially in this isolated moment where you're kind of, to see all that was so, I thought, really powerful and a real great journalistic feat too. I want to start with you again. I was just thinking about the name of your group, and what you were talking about before about the disfranchisement of so many people, and how, here we are, what now, 8 days out from this election. In New York, they opened the voting this weekend, and my senior culture editor spent 4.5 hours in line to vote. Gazillions of people came out to vote. We had a question already asking about the percentage of what is voter participation. And, in general, our country has been fairly dismal in terms of turnout. There's lots of predictions that this will be the highest turnout election in a long time, although it's also just a fundamentally new way of voting, in this lead up. I guess I just wonder, well, again, we'll start with you to talk a little bit about, does it feel, how are you feeling about the health of our democracy in terms of voting right now? Like, does it feel, I think more people are engaged in this election than we've seen in a long time. More people watched the first debate, right? Not that it was a great testament to our democracy, but how are you looking at this question of turnout and access, and how are you feeling about, is the uprising that you talked about from the summer going to translate into more participation and therefore a healthier democracy, do you think?
Well, first, let me just say I'm jealous that you're in New York, because in New York, you get to vote for president on the Working Families Party line, which, like, I don't get in California. I don't get to actually say what my values are while I'm making my presidential choice. Like, I just have to pick between the options. But in New York, you actually have the opportunity to be a Working Families Party voter, which is, I'm just jealous. Like, I wish I had that. So that's one way you're cooler than me. Look,
I live in New Jersey, so I'm not that cool. Don't worry.
Oh, anyway. Darn. Okay. Well, if you do live in New York, vote on Working Families Party line.
A lot of good things going on the best coast also over there.
Yes. It all remains to be seen. Right now, I think, look, our goal for the last 4 years has been to mobilize the vote, right? It has been to get the folks who decided, I was proud to be an organizer and be a part of 2008 and 2012. Two of the highest performance turnout elections in the history of our country. In fact, when I was in Wisconsin, we had the second highest increase in Black voter turnout in 2012 than had ever been registered in the state.
Wow.
And I feel dismayed and disappointed, right, at 2016 and the number of folks who decided to sit out, not because their reasons weren't valid, but because they deserve better out of our democracy, right? They deserve to be able to participate. So, I think that for 4 years, we've been talking about mobilizing the vote, and we've seen great examples, right? We have the most diverse, most female Congress we've ever had in the history of our country. I think that was largely because we were able to mobilize so many votes. But in this election, we also have this very strange, I don't even know how to describe it, but we have to guard the votes. We are all actually have to be voter guardians now to make sure that everybody who casts a ballot, that their ballots actually get counted, that they don't get thrown out, that they don't get messed with, that we don't halt the counting of the ballots 2 days after the election because we've had the largest vote by mail and we still haven't determined the winner, and one of the two candidates declares they're the victor, right? And then it moves to a Supreme Court that, speaking of a flaw, right, 5 of the last 7 Supreme Court justices have been seated by Republicans, despite Democrats having won the, popular vote and presidential elections in many of those instances. And so I think, this is the real question. It will not just be can we mobilize the largest voter turnout we've seen in our lifetimes? I certainly hope so. I'm deploying to Wisconsin soon in a couple of days, and I'm going to hopefully be a part of that. But the question is, will we be able to guard the vote? Will we all be on the front lines, for democracy? Are we willing to get in the streets to, make sure that every vote is counted? Are we willing to have the uncomfortable conversations? Are we willing to say, actually, Fox News can't call the election, right? Because there are literally millions, tens of millions of votes that have not been counted yet. These are real questions. And I think there's a level of uncertainty, right, about what will happen at a level I don't ever remember experiencing. I have experienced, will we win or will we not win? I have not experienced in my lifetime a president of the United States who refuses to commit to a peaceful transition of power. And so it is a little bit different.
When will we know?
Exactly. It's a little bit different. And people should know that we will not have the election results on election night. It is on, and unless there's some crazy landslide and the polls are super off for some, strange reason, we will not be able to know what the outcome of this election is, at least for several days, if not several weeks after the election. And that is a period in which an authoritarian, right, or a fascist regime can really do damage to the structure and the fabric of our democracy.
Ari, both Ari and Gina, I'd love to have your take on how you're seeing the question of the health of our democracy as we head into this unprecedented election. It still seems so upside down that people are voting earlier than ever, and we're going to find out later than ever. I don't know. There's something very unsettling about all of it.
Certainly in upside down times in a lot of ways. I think that the upside to some of the polarization, to some of the really troubling things that we've seen from elected officials has been that it has mobilized people. So the distrust and the apathy with our democracy, that's kind of the enemy number one. Enemy number two might be polarization, but it's good when people get out there and get involved in movements. It's good when people want to register folks to vote. It's really good when we raise our voices. That, right, the notion that this country isn't perfect and that it's our job as citizens and that we have the ability to change it, that is what is beautiful about America. And that is some of what we, whether we're civil society leaders, religious leaders, and elected officials, that's the messaging that they need to be putting out there. And it's so hard to do in an election season, right? In an election season, it's usually, you got to come out here because otherwise our enemies will win. I am part of the Orthodox Jewish community. We're very split. I hear so much demonization about the other and the belief almost that when we do hear that result, whether it's November 3rd, 4th, 5th, December, January, that we are not going to be able to go on depending on who wins. And I hear it, by the way, on both sides, not just with the re-election of the president, but with an election of Biden-Harris ticket as well. And some of our job is to have enough faith in ourselves and in this country. And some of what we've seen with the protests and coming out for Black Lives Matter and others is that we can get out there. Regardless of the result, the activation of civil society is something that we have in our tool belt. I would love to see us get past the Manichaean view of good versus evil in the political rhetoric. But above all, maybe I'm naive, but I really do believe that we have the ability to change this country. And some of how we do it is by making sure that all those words that motivate so many Americans, that broad chunk, whether it's justice, patriotism, liberty, freedom, all these terms can't belong to just one group or another. They're ours to shape. They're in the hands of immigrants. They're in the hands of African Americans and Jews and Muslims and white Americans and others, right? That, like, if we cut through some of the election talk, I really believe that as Americans, we can come together and do this. But some of it is that we need to make sure that the faith in democratic institutions stays there. That's some of the job of our leadership right now.
Gina, how are you seeing it play out in the immigrant communities where you work? Are you feeling like people are more motivated than ever to participate in the democracy if they can, or that people are, there's so much, it's such a crisis, so much going on that it's harder and harder to find the pathways to participate?
I think it's both. I think there's a tension, right? There's an incredible amount of fear just generally to show up in any kind of a government official space, right? Where documentation is required. Even if you are legal and work authorized in this country, right? There is still an incredible amount of fear to interact with government institutions under this administration. That has become the reality. So I think there's a mix of that, but then I think there's a real understanding of like the importance of this election. I think, we're seeing that across the board around mobilization of civil society all over the country. There's a real understanding why democracy matters and what happens when a democracy fails and why we need to all become incredibly active in order to ensure its health, right? So I oftentimes tell people, like, you would go to the gym for your own well-being, right? To maintain your health. Democracies also need work and effort and energy to be maintained, right? And that's not voting for only presidential elections. That's not only voting, that's a lot of things. And I think that's a muscle that we're starting to integrate into people's mindsets around this is our responsibility collectively. But I think to Jennifer's point, like our largest group of people are those that don't even engage at all with democracy. And that is a really big challenge. The only additive thing I can add to this conversation is this is a long game, right? Like our country has changed. You know, Jennifer said like our country was initially designed for the exploitation of labor to the benefit of a group of people called indentured servitude and slavery, right? And we have grown under sort of the auspices of that system. That's the same with our democracy. Our democracy was designed for a very specific thing around representation, and that has got to grow and evolve too. And that's going to take all of us paying a lot of attention and putting a lot of time and effort, no matter who wins these elections, right? So I would just say, like, some of us, when Obama won, we were like, woo, we did it, like done. And now we realize like, oh, wow, there was a whole lot of ground game work that we didn't spend time and energy on, and that we need to continue to do that as every individual. And so I would say for everybody on this call, like stay engaged, stay informed, stay calling people, stay organizing your friends, stay getting out the vote, stay doing all of those things. And then the additional thing, just because we do workforce, is, you know, if you work anywhere, you have an opportunity to increase representation. You have an opportunity to allow a seat for other voices to be heard. You have the ability to lean out and let other people lean in. You have the ability to be an echo chamber. You have the ability to do so much that allows us to really change how we think of culture, how we think of how people belong and show up. And that has ripple effects in civil society, right? So we can be doing a lot right now.
So we've got just a few minutes left. I'm going to ask each of you to think about what we'll do as our kind of closing round, which is to sort of build on what Gina just was talking about, to really bring it down to an individual level. I'd love for each of you to give each of us a suggestion for something we can really do on an individual level, not so much about like holding up democracy, but really about bridging divides. This discussion began about the really just deepest divisions between people of different ethnic or racial groups, different economic groups, different political views. I'd love your guidance or advice on one thing that an individual on this call can do to be more empathetic, be more connected to somebody who's really different from themselves. But first, we have a question from Rebecca Neuwirth, who I guess who works at Upwardly Global now, used to work at AJC. I don't know, Jennifer, if you have a relationship with her too. I'm sure you do. Anyway, she gets the kavod of asking this question because you all know her. So her question is, with what quote unquote segment of the population or economy or political world is it most possible to see positive change and move as opposed to doubling down on conspiracy theories, etc. So whoever wants to take a stab at that, and then we will talk about, I'd love to just bring it down super small. What's one thing each of us can do to build a bridge? So but starting with Rebecca's question, what segment of the population is it most possible to see positive change in? Where are you seeing good things happening? Jennifer?
Well, I mean, I think I'll say that almost all of the social change that has occurred in this country has been the direct result of the like powerful imaginations and the limitless boundaries of young people, right? Like we think of Martin Luther King like, oh, Martin Luther King, like, you know, he's this icon. Really, he was like a 20-year-old kid who like, you know, was an organizer and like changed the world, right? And so I think whether it's the Dreamers movement or the movement for Black Lives, the Fight for 15, you know, led by, you know, young 18 to 24-year-old fast food and home care and, you know, gig economy workers, right? It really does feel like every social movement in this country really is like the direct result of like young people refusing to let other people's imaginations of what's possible for their lives be the boundaries of their lives. So I would just say maybe that ties into your final question of like, what's one thing that each of us can do on this call? You know, I think we often hold up people who are most impacted and we go, you know, this centers people who are most impacted, or this is about the people who are most impacted. But then oftentimes when it like comes time to really truly listen to them, right? Black women experience this a lot too when we say trust Black women, right? But like when it truly comes time to listen to what the solutions to those problems that they experience the most are, we all of a sudden all know better, right? Because we have an education or we studied it this way, or like, you know, we just can't let go of our connection to capitalism, whatever our feelings are about it. We often are dismissive of those folks when it comes time for them to say, here's the solution. So I think if you truly want to make Black Lives Matter, then you got to go to the Movement for Black Lives webpage and look at their agenda, policy agenda for Black lives. And you got to get comfortable with some of the things that might be pushing your boundaries of what you think is possible for the country to exist. If you truly believe that you know, no person should be exploited for their labor and that nobody in this country should be working full time and still living in abject poverty, then we're gonna have to get a little bit comfortable with our idealization of billionaires and like the way the economy works and our willingness to like, you know, pay taxes and all of the other things. So I think that's, you know, that would be my advice, which is to really listen to those folks and, you know, learn from them.
And I did put the link to the vision for the platform and policy positions of the Movement for Black Lives into the chat. I also want to acknowledge that I hadn't seen this before, but Susan Zellman actually had asked the question that I asked. She said, I'd love to hear from each of the panelists specific steps, even small ones, that individuals can take to help build the bridges and meet the challenges. So Ari, tackle that one, and then we'll finish up with Gina. Before we do that, I just want to thank Lisa Lepson for producing this event. Along with Dina Cooperman and Robbie Kaplan and some helpful people at AJC and Upwardly Global and the Center for Popular Democracy. Thank you all again, all this great audience, for joining us. And please support these organizations, subscribe to The Forward, and take these small steps that Ari and Gina are going to build on what Jennifer said. Ari.
Yeah, thanks. For small steps, we've been talking a lot about outwardly facing and bridge building. I'm gonna talk about what it's like to face inward to our own communities. The Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, an American Muslim think tank, found that more than having a Muslim friend, actually knowing about Islam, studying, education, was a greater predictor of lower levels of Islamophobia. And it's true for other forms of hatred as well. So read voices that are out there. If you can't meet the people, obviously meet the people if you can. But then at home, when you hear something going on, if it's intergenerational, if it's among a friend group, you got to be what Deborah Lipstadt calls the impolite dinner guest. That you find the respectful way to say, if you hear something stereotyping, hatred, conspiracy theory oriented, you say, I'm sorry, I just don't think it's okay to speak that way. Or, you know, that's offensive to some people because X, Y, and Z. And it's hard to do, and you want to do it while preserving your relationships, but we're best served when we can look at our own and make sure that we're demonstrating the values and ethics we expect of others.
Great. Gina, the last word.
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, I think representation matters, and anything we can do to increase representation or enhance people's voices when they're speaking, and that includes women of color, right? As Jennifer was saying, oftentimes people don't believe us when we say, oh, I think this person did that because they're racist. Believe them, just believe them, right? And don't ask like, well, maybe this or maybe that. I think it's really sort of saying like, I believe you and I acknowledge that, but I also want to support your voice and your solutions. And we can all do that because we all know people of color in our lives and we're all able to show up for them in a conversation at work. I think if any of us are in places where we can help increase representation, whether it's like volunteering for a political campaign or increasing representation as a hiring manager, I think that's also something that's going to be critically important because we know if we can get 25 to 30% of representation, that's when we can start having a conversation about what this culture should look like in a specific institution or in a specific place. And then we can change and redefine what that culture looks like.
I love that. Thank you for such practical steps, all of you. And thank you for being with us. I will add one other step, which is read something that you don't agree with. Read something from a publication you think you don't agree with and try to really understand the perspective of the person writing it and see if you can't respect that too. Thank you to Gina and Jennifer and Ari, again to Lisa Lepson, and thank you to all of us for joining us. Have a great Monday.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.